Good evening, folks. Thank you for joining us. Biscuits and SEC. We're on show 23 or something, 22, I think. So excited to be here tonight. Thank you guys for joining us all on this Wednesday night. We got a fun show planned. We're going to talk a little bit about the top incoming transfers on offense and look just across the SEC about who Hammer and I think are some of the most impactful transfers who are going to be coming into the SEC in 2025. And then we'll also talk a little bit about the tournament, the SEC tournament starting today. We had a couple really good games to start out with. The lower half of the conference getting their games in today, but some teams on the bubble who are still trying to figure out if they're going to be able to get to the NCAA tournament or if they're going to have to deny a bid to the NIT. So we'll get into that a little bit later as well. Before we get into it tonight, as always, please do sign up for the Biscuits and SEC newsletter, the Morning Biscuits newsletter, written by Hammer and myself. Hammer wrote a great one this morning. It comes to you Wednesdays in the off season and then on Mondays and Fridays during the season. So everything going on within the SEC, you can check it out and make sure you're caught up and make sure you're caught up so that you can talk at the water cooler at work and let folks know that you love the SEC as much as we do. So thank you guys for joining us again tonight. Hammer, what's going on?
Not much. Excited for the show tonight. Excited for the SEC basketball tournament, March Madness. We have conference play starting up this weekend in SEC baseball. I found myself writing the newsletter this morning and just reminding myself what a great time of year this is. The weather's getting warm, conference play in baseball. You know, that's one of my favorite times of year is SEC play. Out of conference is fine. You know, baseball's back. All right, cool. But it doesn't quite hit the same when you're playing, you know, Austin Peay or Long Island University for a 3-game set versus the slate this weekend is awesome, as you would expect on the baseball diamond. So busy time of year, fun time of year, and excited to dive in.
No doubt. Should be a good one. And yeah, like you said, I'm excited to come out of hibernation as the weather starts to warm up, especially down here in Texas and across the South. So before we get into it, we are sponsored tonight by the Steer Agency. Football is all about strategy, just like winning in business, whether you're dialing up the perfect play on Saturdays or looking to dominate in public affairs, PR, or digital marketing. You need a team that delivers results. That's where the Steer Agency comes in. They craft winning strategies that get you seen, heard, and ahead of the competition. So don't just play the game, control it. Visit thesteeragency.com today and take your brand to the next level. So thank you to the guys at the Steer Agency for sponsoring the show tonight. So now we'll go right into it. The top incoming transfers of 2025. This week we'll be doing the offense, and then next week we'll talk about the defense, and we'll go our top 5. So I'll give my top 5. Hammer will give his top 5. We'll kind of go back and forth and discuss those, as well as a couple other names to keep an eye on going into 2025. We understand it is very difficult. Look, we watch this stuff, we cover this stuff, we talk about this stuff in the newsletter and, you know, on this show and across social media channels. So we try to watch it really closely. It's difficult to keep up with all the transfers that are coming in. So this week, next week, will serve as kind of a refresher, and we'll also talk about some folks to watch, some guys to watch coming into next year. So Hammer, we'll start it off real quick just with your list, and I think we can reveal your list, and then we can go and just talk about, you know, you can talk about why you picked your number 1 pick, and then discuss that a little bit, and then I'll reveal my list. So here is Hammer's top offensive transfers in 2025. So give us a little bit of detail as to what went into this one, Hammer.
Yeah, so like you said, it's very hard, not a little bit hard, but very hard to keep up with all the transfers coming in. So, of course, it helps to rely on you know, platforms like 247 Sports that kind of break all this stuff down for you. But, you know, when I was looking at it, I was kind of just using this as a like my sort of assumption or best guess as to who y'all are going to be hearing about next fall, right? Whereas, you know, there's so many transfers, and to narrow it down to 5 is probably a bit naive, but I thought this list of 5, along with the honorable mention of Nick Anderson, was like, okay, it's a pretty good summary of the guys who I think are going to make an immediate impact at their next school, and you're probably going to be hearing about at the end of the year, right? So am I saying that Eric Singleton or Noah Thomas are going to have decidedly better years than Concepcion or Nick Anderson or Barry and Brown, any number of wide receivers? Not specifically, more just that I think they're going to make an impact. I expect you to be hearing their names on Saturdays in the fall quite a bit. And so that's kind of how I formulated this list, and kind of why it starts and ends to me with Mateer at Oklahoma, right? We talked really over the last couple of weeks, whether it was the hot seat conversation with Venables, followed by the, quarterbacks under pressure with Mateer now, like Oklahoma needs him to have a really, really good season. They really need the magic that he had last year at Wazoo with his offensive coordinator, I'm drawing a blank on his name, but has also come over from Wazoo to Oklahoma. They need that synergy to be replicated in Norman, and he's got to have a good year. I think, I was looking a little bit at his stats. He threw 29 touchdowns to 7 picks last year, so he's got the pedigree. He's done it, not quite at an SEC level, certainly with the kind of cobbled together Pac-2 schedule that Washington State played last year. But, he was a very sought after player in the portal for a reason. And I think, for things to break right at Oklahoma, they need Mateer to pan out and have like a really, really strong year. So I thought he was kind of, again, like pretty clear number 1 for me in terms of just like, hey, guy who's going to have a big impact on his school and has the potential to have a very good year, and you're going to be hearing his name constantly because he's going to start at Oklahoma.
Yeah, no doubt. So I like how you formulated that. I thought along similar lines in picking who I thought were going to be the most impactful transfers, and really it comes down to that word, impact, right? Like who can come in and create the biggest impact at their program, which also means you're going to be hearing a lot about them on Saturdays next fall. So for my list here, I had the same thing as you. John Mateer, number 1, coming from Wazoo to Oklahoma. He can make a massive impact just for the sheer fact that Oklahoma went 6-7 last year, right? Like, and obviously the QB position was such a big problem for Oklahoma. Again, we can, they had a lot of injuries. We understand that. We know that the wide receiver position had a lot of injuries, but they didn't utilize Jackson Arnold well. They bench him, and they go to the backup. Why am I forgetting his name right now?
Michael Hawkins Jr.
Thank you. So Michael Hawkins, right. So bring in John Mateer. He can elevate that program if he is, that good to another level. He can make a massive impact. So that's why, for me, he was potentially the most impactful transfer of 2025. And then you go down the list here, very wide receiver heavy for me. I think we actually both ended up with 4 wide receivers on our lists. And then for my honorable mention, I've got, we have some differences here, which I like, and we can discuss. But I think that's just because there's so many transfers. There's a lot of guys that can make an impact, right? And there's even guys that we'll talk about later. I've got, a graphic with some other names on it as well for folks to look out for, because like you said earlier, in your open, this list is only 5 people, right? 6 people, 7 people for me, because I cheated a little bit and put 2 at number 2. But there are a lot of guys that you can look at who could make some really big impacts next year who are transferring in just from the sheer amount of transfers. And you had an offensive lineman on your list. I don't have an offensive lineman on the list, but there are multiple big-time offensive linemen who are coming out of the portal to different schools, LSU being one of them, Auburn being another, and a couple others who are getting some big. Oklahoma's getting a big offensive lineman as well. So, a lot. We pick mostly skill positions because that's where a lot of impact can be made. But those guys in the trenches matter too. So, a lot of potential impact there. But I'm with you. I think John Mateer is potentially the best and guy who can make the biggest impact as a transfer coming in this year to Oklahoma. He reminds me a lot of Baker Mayfield. I mean, you touched on his passing stats, right? But he also can run the ball. I think he had 15 touchdowns last year on the ground. So he's a dual threat. He's 6'1", and really can sling it around like Baker as well. So maybe another Baker clone here headed to Oklahoma. So it'll be fun to watch him. And then you had at number 2, Eric Singleton. So give us a little bit of reason why Eric Singleton at Auburn is potentially a big impact player for you next year.
Yeah. So, this is, I guess this is where it gets kind of tough. Like you said, picking skill position guys, because there's so many of them, A, and then B, really, they are pretty hit or miss. I feel like a lot of times you have certain fan bases, and as Aggies, we can certainly rattle off a few guys who we've been really excited about coming in the transfer portal, and then they just don't really amount to much. So very difficult to try to pinpoint guys where you think that there is, a lot of upside or potentially a good fit. And that's kind of what helped me settle on Singleton, is I think he's just a good fit because I think Auburn has plenty of weapons already with Cam Coleman and then a couple other guys they got in the portal. So obviously they're losing Lambert Smith off of last year's team, but I think Jackson Arnold is in the right system, a pretty good quarterback who can push the ball downfield. Maybe some of his turnover issues will not be solved, but just in terms of like a quarterback that I feel comfortable making passes downfield, I think he's a pretty good option there. So that gives me hope for Singleton. And I look at where he came from, right? We're very familiar with Haynes King. I love the dude. He's not the most accurate quarterback downfield, and he's not even really a guy that pushes the ball downfield a ton.
Yes.
He had a good year this year. Again, I'm not trying to disparage him, but when you're talking about an offense that has the potential to feature a talented wide receiver like Singleton, Georgia Tech is not an offense that comes to mind. They're much more, run the ball, hit the short, intermediate game, quick game. And despite that, Singleton put up over 700 yards 2 years in a row. So 2023 and 2024, he had over 700 yards. So I think in that offense, with a Cam Coleman already on the outside, I'm drawing a blank. I'll look at it.
Thompson is the other star. Mm-hmm.
Right. So they've got some weapons. I think that's just a good situation for him to kind of slide into. And I'm not saying he's going to have 1,000 yards and 10 touchdowns. That's way too lofty. But I think for a guy like him with his skill set to come into that offense and be, at best, probably a 1A option, but at worst, the second or third option, I think there's going to be a lot of catches for him to be had in Auburn's offense this year. So that's kind of why I thought he would make an immediate impact.
I think you're right. And also can be hugely impactful for Jackson Arnold, right? I mean, Jackson Arnold last year, to me, I've said this, a couple times on the show, I'm not ready to give up on Jackson Arnold just yet. The kid has immense talent. He's got a high ceiling. It didn't work out for him at Oklahoma. One of the big reasons for that, two big reasons for that. One was the offensive line where he was running for his life constantly. And two was the fact that the wide receivers, though Oklahoma has talent at wide receiver, they did last year, they were hurt. They were, it was a rotating cast of characters constantly through at least 8 games last year. So he never really had stability there at Oklahoma, never really, was put in a position to succeed, whether it was the offense not fitting him, the offensive line not playing well, the wide receivers being hurt constantly. And now at Auburn, he's got at least 3, right? If Perry Thompson steps up, we already know Cam Coleman's got, incredible ability. And then Eric Singleton, just a, proven guy who can be that outlet, right? Like hot read, right? He's got the speed. He can be that guy on the slant where throw it and replace the blitzer. So he can make a big impact in that way, right? And be a safety valve and somebody who is reliable for Jackson Arnold, especially in those first few games as they're trying to get their feet under him in a new offense and a new quarterback breaking him in. So that's a solid pick. I did not have Eric Singleton in my top 5, and there's no real reason for that. I do think that Eric Singleton is going to make a massive impact. I just chose to go a little bit of a different route with some of the wide receivers that I chose. And then 2 of those, at number 2 here, Zachariah Branch and Noah Thomas. I think that both of those guys going to Georgia, you could probably – I think they're both going to have a big impact, frankly. And there's a couple wide receivers on this list, and I'll just mention this real quick about why I chose 3 of them, which includes Kevin or KC Concepcion and Isaiah Horton as well. There's a lot of young quarterbacks in this league. You've got at Georgia, it's going to be we're breaking in somebody new, whether it's Ryan Puglisi or it's going to be Gunnar Stockton. Then at A&M, you have Marcel Reed, who's has some experience, but not a lot of experience, and they're going to be really trying to elevate Marcel Reed's game. So young quarterback needs a really good wide receiver. Isaiah Horton from Miami to Alabama, going to be breaking in a new quarterback. So I think that those guys can make big impacts and be a safety valve, somebody who can be reliable for these young quarterbacks that we're going to be breaking in across the SEC. And I think that, these guys at number 2 here, Zachariah Branch and Noah Thomas, Georgia, especially since Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey left, right? Last year, it was very glaring that they were missing that guy, right? Or the wide receiver. And they really haven't had, I know Ladd McConkey was really good, but in terms of like a freak athlete at wide receiver, which Georgia was known for a long time, they haven't really had one of those at wide receiver since like George Pickens. And both of these guys have that athletic ceiling that is just through the roof. Noah Thomas never really hit his ceiling at A&M. They did not utilize him to his full potential, and they have that potential at Georgia to do that. So what are your thoughts on those 2 at Georgia this year?
Yeah, very similar thoughts. So I had Noah Thomas on my list as well. I think I had him. Let me just confirm. Yeah, I had him at number 3. So basically right in line with you. I'll briefly touch on Zachariah Branch and then dive a little bit into Noah Thomas. And just my only reason for not including Zachariah Branch is, unlike you, I decided to choose 1 player instead of 2. And between the 2, I just liked Noah Thomas slightly better.
Yeah.
Really the only reason, because we'll get into the Noah Thomas stuff, but like when you look at his career at A&M, there is reasons why his production was not very high and why he hit the transfer portal.
Yeah,
I'm not really clear on what was going on at SC with Zachariah Branch. I mean, you would think a Lincoln Riley offense with a talented wide receiver would be a great fit. And I'll, hand up, I'll be the first to tell you, I don't watch a ton of USC football. So I'm sure there's Trojan fans out there that can give me the backstory on, what went wrong or why his production wasn't that great there. But that's the only thing that held me up on him, because talent-wise, he's fantastic, super fast, great with the ball in his hands, can make guys miss. Just, I'm not sure what was missing there. On Noah Thomas, you hit on it. I mean, look, I don't watch a ton of USC football. I watch every darn minute of A&M football, unfortunately, and I can tell you, he just didn't have a quarterback. I mean, Noah Thomas, over his time, I think went through. Geez, let's think about it here. Haynes King, Zach Calzada to Jalen Henderson in that one season where they had multiple injuries. Then there was the Wigman, some in and out of Wigman over a couple of years, and then Marcel Reed. So there's just zero continuity in the A&M offense over the 3 years that Noah Thomas was there. So I looked at him and his time at A&M and thought this is much less an indictment on him as a player and much more just this offense has no direction, no identity, not really any clear, idea of what they're trying to accomplish. And so for a guy like him, I don't blame him for hitting the portal. I think he probably looks around and says, hey, I've got the body type to be an NFL receiver, and I just need to go somewhere that I can match that, my skill set with some production and put that on tape. Because unfortunately for him, he hasn't been able to put a ton on tape. It's a lot of blocking or routes that, end up with the ball not coming his way because the ball's not going anybody's way because, A&M quarterbacks getting their teeth kicked in the backfield or, they're not very accurate downfield. So I also think too with Thomas, again, they gave him a slight edge over Branch. It's just his body type, So even if he does have some trouble adjusting or Georgia maybe can't figure out how to use him, whatever the case may be, he's a guy that can still go up and get it in the red zone, which he did at A&M, despite having really not many catches, very, very few yards. I mean, he didn't even crack not even close to 1,000 yards across 3 seasons, but he had double-digit touchdowns, I think, across those 3 seasons. So he's a guy that can go up and get it in the red zone. And when you think of a wideout coming out of the portal, making an immediate impact, red zone is a pretty easy thing to do, right? Anybody can run a fade. So I think he's poised for a big year.
Yeah, I think you're right. I totally agree. I have always thought that Noah Thomas was just never utilized to his full potential at A&M, and that he has the potential to be a top 3 wide receiver in the conference. So we'll see what happens there. Zachariah Branch, he had 47 receptions last year for 500 yards. He's got only 3 total TDs right in his time at SC. So you could be right about that. My only guess is that, the quarterback situation there, right? He had Caleb Williams, I guess 2 years ago. So, but he was a freshman. And then this year it was kind of shaky, after the first couple games, Miller Moss gets benched. And, so it was kind of like, it was a little bit shaky there at quarterback this year. So that potentially could have been the issue with Zachariah Branch. But highly, highly sought after, right, in the portal. So
yeah,
it seems that most people think that he still, has the potential to be a number 1 wideout going into 2025. So, okay, if you guys have any transfers as well that you're looking forward to and excited about, leave some in the comments. Shoot us a DM on Twitter. We would love to talk a little bit about some that we may not be featuring and may not be talking about on our lists and touch on some of those. So make sure to leave a comment if you guys have some, especially for your team, right? If you got an Alabama transfer, LSU transfer, Auburn transfer you're excited about, we would love to hear about those. So, okay, Hammer, let's get into your next one here after Noah Thomas, because we just talked a lot about him. You had him at number 3. How about going to Noah Thomas's former school here, KC Concepcion, coming from NC State? There's a lot of hype around him headed to A&M. And what are your thoughts on his potential there in College Station?
Yeah, really, I think it kind of, to me, comes down to just there's a massive void to fill for A&M at wide receiver. And Concepcion is a guy who was extremely sought after in the portal. He was ranked, I think he's like the 16th overall transfer portal player. So recruiting services think highly of him. In my opinion, he basically steps onto A&M's campus and is immediately wide receiver number 1. Now, as I just said, wide receiver position at number 1 at A&M over the last few years hasn't amounted to much. So just because he's slated for a starting role and going to be getting a lot of snaps doesn't necessarily mean he's going to produce. However, I think with his pedigree and the fact that he just has to get a lot of targets, I think he's ready to make a big impact. I mean, you look at his stats over 2 years at NC State. His freshman year was actually quite a bit better. He had 71 catches, 839 yards for 10 TDs. But kind of similar to what I said about Noah Thomas in a smaller little snapshot. Last year his production fell off to 53 catches, 460 yards, and 6 touchdowns. But NC State was a complete dumpster last year. I mean, they bring in Grayson McCall. He isn't good and then gets concussed and retires from football altogether. I mean, their offense was really pathetic. So understandable why his production fell off year over year. So I just look at that, again, kind of similar to what I said about Singleton. It's like in a not very prolific offense at NC State, he put up really good numbers one year, decent to solid numbers last year. I think in an offense where he should be featured a lot, likely as the number 1 option for Marcel Reed, I think he's just going to get a lot of targets, and he's a talented enough guy that he can make make stuff out of those targets.
Definitely. He reminds me a lot of Moose Muhammad. He's got the same size, the same speed. However, unlike Moose Muhammad, I think that he will actually get to play at A&M. Who knows why? There's lots and lots of speculation as to why Moose Muhammad never really materialized to do much of anything at A&M other than a few highlight catches. But he's talked a lot too about, I think he also probably a difference is that KC is talked about as someone who is a very meticulous route runner, and he studies the game, he studies film, and he was well sought after a lot in part because of that. I don't know that he's somebody who takes the top off the defense and is a burner and is going to just fly right past you, but he's very meticulous and smart about his route running and very precise. So I also had him on my list as well at number 4. And for many similar reasons, as you said, and going back to the impact, right? He can make a huge impact for A&M because they have been missing a wide receiver who can really make a big impact. And now they had Noah Thomas last year. He could have, they just didn't utilize him well. And they had the issues with Connor Weigman, with his injury or his poor play. And then also, breaking in Marcel Reed. Marcel Reed was just kind of on a roller coaster last year. So if Marcel Reed is able to step up, KC Concepcion is going to be a big piece of that. So that's kind of what I'm looking at from him. And I think he's going to have a pretty solid year. Remember, A&M has not had a wide receiver drafted since Josh Reynolds, all the way back in 2014, I believe, was when he was drafted. 2015, maybe, whatever. It was 2014. Yeah.
No, it was later than that.
No, you're right. 2015.
Yeah, it was sometime. Oh, I can't remember. 16 maybe, but anyway, it's been a long
time.
The entire Jimbo Fisher tenure.
Long time. Since A&M used to, have really good wide receivers that they were bringing out. I mean, Mike Evans is going to be a Hall of Famer, right? Like, there have been guys that have come out of A&M and materialized as pretty good wide receivers in the NFL, but it's been a long time since they've had one. KC has the chance to be one coming out of A&M.
Yeah. One more thing on him, that I'm interested to see, and I think again kind of lends itself to him potentially making an impact. If you look at his 2 seasons at NC State, over those 2023, 2024, he had 60 carries for almost a little over 350 yards. So they like to get him the ball a lot. And I don't know that A&M will do that. I mean, I guess we'll see. I feel like with Colin Klein at the helm at OC, it's hard to know exactly what he's trying to do, just because last year was very discombobulated with Weigman starting, getting hurt, going to Reed, going back to Weigman, and then back to Reed. So, and they're very different quarterbacks too. It'd be one thing if, hey, we're both pocket passers, but it felt like Klein was constantly kind of shifting, because when Reed's in there, hey, we're heavy run, zone read. When Weigman's in there, basically not doing his own read at all. So very different kind of conflicting styles. And I'm interested to see if, now that Reed is the set in stone starter and they have all spring and fall camp and everything to prepare for that, if there is a little bit more, just misdirections, jet sweeps, things of that nature, because Concepcion can be a weapon there. And again, that's another thing that is pretty easy to implement, right? Hey, let's say he's having trouble transfer, he's not picking up the playbook, he doesn't know the route tree. Well, he knows how to run a jet sweep, so we can get him the ball that way. Again, just makes me think that he's going to get a lot of touches, because A&M needs playmakers.
And, A&M has been missing somebody like an Ananias Smith since he left. And they've got Terry Bussey on the roster. Don't forget Terry Bussey. That kid really could have a breakout year. But with Terry Bussey and somebody like KC Concepcion, you've got a lot of options, right? Like, especially for 2 guys who can you can gadget in and out of the slot, put him at wide receiver, put him at running back, give the defense different looks. So I think Colin Klein is really excited to have KC Concepcion on campus, as well as having Terry Bussey back in year 2. Likely, again, going to be on offense instead of defense, as for those who don't know much about Terry Bussey, he was a 5-star recruit, defensive guy and an offensive guy, can play cornerback, can play wide receiver, elite at both positions. So he played offense almost all of last year, and definitely needs help on the defense, especially in the secondary. But it looks like probably he's going to stay on the offensive side of the ball. We'll see. Okay, and then I'll kick us off here again, since we touched on Casey Concepcion, and that was a mutual one for us. Berrien Brown for me. I love this kid. Berrien Brown had a great year 2 years ago. He's an exceptional wide receiver. He's fast. He can catch the ball. And when he's got the ball in his hands, he's pretty electric. And they just weren't able to get him the ball last year. They didn't get him the ball enough. He didn't have enough targets. Nobody had enough targets last year with Brock Vandegrift behind center.
Yeah.
And they just had difficulty right at the quarterback position. And his talents were not showcased enough. But both he and Dane Key leaving Kentucky and going into the portal, and then how highly sought after they were, I think tells you all you need to know, right? The problem was with Kentucky and behind center, and not with Berrien Brown or with Dane Key. And so I'm looking for Berrien Brown to have a big year, especially when you talk about how, LSU is losing a lot at wide receiver, and they needed to backfill. And they did just that. Nick Anderson, who, you have on your list, which we'll bring back up in a second. But Nick Anderson, right, your honorable mention, they bring him in from Oklahoma. They bring in Berrien Brown. So they needed to backfill at wide receiver. They did that. They needed to give Garrett Nussmeier some weapons. They did that. So, and LSU looking to have a big year. So I think Berrien Brown, in terms of impact, as an impact transfer, he has the potential to have a really big year there at LSU, especially with the way they run their offense, which is very wide receiver centric now, right? Like for a couple years, at least now, it has been focus on the passing game versus the running game, which is what, most have become accustomed to with LSU. We'll see. They need to get back to have a decent running game next year. We'll see if they're able to do that. Brought in a couple offensive line transfers. But all in all, I think Berrien Brown is poised for a big year.
Yeah, I think that's a great pick. I can touch a little bit on my honorable mention here because it's the same sort of reasoning. But again, especially with these skill position guys, I'm going to mess up the saying, but it's, 6 ways, half a dozen, or, whatever the saying is, where there's a million different ways you could go. And it's kind of all the same, right? Because I went with Nick Anderson, my honorable mention, but I think you have to have an LSU receiver there because they throw the ball. Nussmeier is a, talented, good quarterback, kind of, using my similar logic to what I said earlier about Jackson Arnold as somebody that whether or not he turns out to be a great quarterback, I don't know, but I think he's someone that can push the ball down the field. Well, I know Nussmeier is. We've seen that for a full season. So if a guy like Berrien Brown is open downfield, good chance Nussmeier's going to hit him. The other thing, too, I think Berrien Brown brings to the table is he's a pretty good returner. He's good in the return game. And
good point.
That's another way that a transfer can make immediate impact, right? All right, the offense is a little complicated. Maybe he's having trouble. Well, he can return punts. He can return kicks. So I would agree. I think he's poised. The only reason I went with Nick Anderson, truthfully, is he was rated higher in the 247, I think, because of just his recruiting pedigree. And almost I'm interested to see that because we just didn't see him at Oklahoma this year due to injury. So I'm kind of almost just deferring to the recruiting services in terms of maybe he is that good and we just haven't been able to see it because he's been hurt and not really played for most of his career. But to me, I just look at it as, okay, there's a reason he was a big recruit coming out of high school, and there's a reason he's in the top 10, overall transfers or whatever he was in 247, despite doing nothing at Oklahoma. But again, interchangeable there. I think an LSU receiver, whether it's Anderson, Brown, or both, are going to have a big year. And of course they have Aaron Anderson coming back. So they've got a great receiving core. And so far in Kelly's tenure, like you mentioned, have done an excellent job of throwing the football and racking up big time stats for wideouts.
Definitely. And speaking of guys who can return the ball, Zachariah Branch at Georgia. That kid was a return man at USC, returned a couple, I believe, kickoffs to the house. can return punts and kicks. So that'll be interesting to watch him at Georgia. So let's stay here in Baton Rouge and touch a little bit, segue right into the offensive line. You had Josh Thompson, the offensive lineman from Northwestern, I believe a 4-star transfer, coming into LSU. So give us a little bit as to why you chose him. I think it's a pretty solid pick because of just the help that they needed. So yeah, talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So again, I leaned pretty heavy on the 247, rankings, just because there's so many different transfers and to sort through them, especially at the offensive line, where, let's be honest, especially a guy coming out of Northwestern, like I didn't know who this guy was, but I think, the reason I included him was there's a handful of bigger, not meaning physically bigger, but highly ranked offensive line transfers that were coming in. Like you mentioned, I think Ole Miss picked up some, Auburn, excuse me. But the reason I went with Thompson is he's a multi-year starter at Northwestern. One season at right tackle, one at right guard. So he's a little bit versatile. He played there for 4 years. So he's old. He's, 5th-year senior. He's big, 6'5", 310. And kind of what you brought up as you introed this, but the need. We talked about LSU's offensive line last year, not really living up to expectations, but that's last year anyway. Most of those guys are gone. So they're kind of replacing their entire offensive line. So I think there's obviously an opening. That's why they bring a guy like Thompson in, is to fill a need. And they definitely have a need there. And the only other thing I'll add to this is a guy that size, 6'5", 310, who's played right tackle and right guard across 2 seasons in the Big Ten at Northwestern, I have to imagine is a good run blocker, right? He's probably a pretty dang good run blocker who's just going to get after it. We'll see if he can handle the athleticism of some of these SEC teams. I'm not saying he's going to turn into a first-round pick, but I think he's a good candidate for a guy who's going to come in, 5th-year senior from Northwestern, smart guy, earn a starting job, and be hopefully a productive starter for LSU. And like we talked about, especially when it comes to the run game, they need guys like that. So I think there's just a good opportunity for him to come in, earn a starting job, make an immediate impact, and, say if he stays healthy, start 12 games for LSU in what is hopefully, a improved ground game. So that was kind of my reasoning there. But again, I'm not going to act like I'm grinding tape. So I could have made a case for any of the other offensive line options. I just thought the need at LSU and his pedigree, being older, being a mountain of a man, seemed like a good option.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And there's a couple really solid offensive line transfers into the conference, like we touched on, but LSU does have a big need there. So if he is as advertised, he can make a big impact there. And also in protecting Garrett Nussmeier, because at times when he was under pressure last year, that's when he struggled most, right? We touched on it on this show before, especially like starting with the Texas A&M game, when A&M just started going, blitz happy crazy in the second half, and LSU looked like a completely different team. I think they scored 7 points, right, the rest of the way in that game, whereas A&M, put in Marcel Reed, and that was on the defense. But, the offensive line did pretty well in pass pro last year, right? Overall, look at Garrett Nussmeier's stats, right, and the wide receiver stats. They were able to get the ball out, but there were times in a couple different games where they struggled in pass protection, and that's when Garrett Nussmeier really struggled. He has trouble when he's under pressure. So they needed they need their offensive line to step up as well and be better in pass protection. So
yeah, and we'll see on this. Like just looking down the 247 board here, we mentioned a couple other high-profile offensive line guys. Another one's at LSU, so Braylon Moore, inside offensive lineman, probably be slated to play guard from Virginia Tech, is in Baton Rouge. What's his name? Xavier Chaplin,
Yeah, here, I can pull this up now. I put together just a couple other names to watch. So this includes a couple of those offensive line you're talking about.
Yeah.
Especially at the top there, right? Xavier Chaplin headed to Auburn, the top ranked transfer in the portal. Patrick Kutas, I think is how you say it, headed to Ole Miss. Derek Simons headed to Oklahoma, another school that needed big time help along the offensive line. And they get Derek Simons, and he was a 4-star transfer. Cam Dewberry, a little bit overlooked heading to Alabama, but he played a lot. He got a lot of reps at Texas A&M.
Yeah.
And he's headed to Alabama, who needed a little bit of help on the offensive line. So, and then Braylon Moore, who you mentioned, coming from Virginia Tech, and Blacksburg headed down to Baton Rouge for Brian Kelly. So there's a lot of guys to keep an eye on in terms of along the offensive line and in the trenches for some big name programs who needed a lot of help on the offensive line as they really frustrated fans last year in the trenches. So, yeah, like you said, offensive line is going to be a major spot to watch this year because of the amount of guys coming in. And it's always tough to recruit, as everybody knows, right? Recruiting along the offensive line is super difficult, and it's super hard to find guys in the portal who can backfill and who can potentially be big-time pieces on your offensive line. There's only probably maybe 10 in total offensive line transfers who can make a massive impact on the line in any given cycle. So these guys are highly sought after. And we just showed you, I think, 5 on that graphic who are coming in to the SEC. So going to be fascinating to watch the offensive lines in the SEC, especially at some of those big programs. So,
yeah, I totally agree. I think somebody who is more in the weeds in this, feel free to disprove this theory. But I think what you brought up with kind of the shortage of offensive linemen, especially in the portal, it's almost like they're never going to replace quarterback, right? Where quarterback is always, A, the most important position, but B, whether it's NFL draft, high school recruiting, transfer portal recruiting, you're going to have teams kind of overselling themselves in a sense because we need a quarterback. So this could be our guy, right? I love the dude. I hope it pans out, but Zach Calzada kind of feels that way to me, right? Yeah, we're going to go get Zach Calzada. And it's all right, okay, we'll see if this works out. But there may be, you may be overselling what you're getting there a little bit. And I think there's a tendency to do that in the offensive line transfer portal because there's not a ton of dudes. So very, very, very interesting to see how these guys pan out. Because like you said, the idea of going to the portal and getting a wide receiver that's going to start for you, pretty easy. Not saying you're going to get a future NFL guy, but most teams can fill their roster with wide receivers or running backs who are going to contribute from the portal. A lot harder to do at offensive line. So if you can get a guy that can come in and start, that's a massive, massive get.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, there's a lot of human beings who are 5'10" and fast. Not a ton who are 5'10" and fast and can play D1 football, but there's a lot more of those than there are 6'5", 320, right?
Yeah.
Absolute, hogs who can just move a whole lot of earth and a whole lot of people and a whole lot of weight. So
right.
It's just by nature, right? That there's just not a lot of those guys. So when you can find them, right, you're willing to pony up a lot of money now in the NIL era and try and get those guys along the line, especially when they've, your line has struggled, as many of these teams we just mentioned did. So, all right, I'll talk a little bit here about my final 2. Isaiah Horton, I think not a lot of people mentioned this guy, right? But if you look at his stats, he was the 3rd leading wide receiver in almost all categories for Miami last year, who is losing their top 2 wide receivers. So a little interesting he didn't stay there at Miami, although he knows that Cam Ward's leaving, right? So going to be a new quarterback breaking in there. But he's going to a situation in Tuscaloosa where they're also going to be breaking in a new quarterback. So probably got some good NIL money for sure. But he was the 2nd leading wide receiver at Miami in terms of receptions last year. So the kid's got a lot of talent. And, by the way, Alabama has really needed somebody across from Ryan Williams, right? Like Ryan Williams was the big draw last year. He was the big guy who drew a lot of attention, especially in the middle to the second half of the year. And he was able to still get open for the most part, but he drew a lot more attention because Alabama had, some issues at wide receiver and at quarterback. This year, you've got a new quarterback who's going to be coming in, whether it's Ty Simpson or Austin Mack or Keelan Russell as a freshman. And they're going to need not just one, wide receiver who they can rely on. They need a couple. And that's always good when you're breaking in a new quarterback. Just give them as many weapons as possible. So bringing in Isaiah Horton, I think, was a big deal, and kind of somebody who it seems like to me is getting overlooked. And I think he can make an immediate impact by taking those eyes away from Ryan Williams, right, and being another big threat in the wide receiving game, in the receiving game for Alabama. So I'm excited to see what Isaiah Horton can do. And they just needed more weapons last year. Now it seems like they have a decent amount of weapons, more weapons, in my opinion, than they had last year, bringing in Isaiah Horton. So, and in a time, right, where I saw a list today on social media that was talking about how I think they had the question was who needs the biggest year, right? Like who's under the most pressure, a little bit like we have talked about in recent weeks. Number 2, they had Alabama because they were 9-3, right, overall on the regular season, and that's just not up to the Alabama standard. So, who needs to have a big year? Alabama. Well, bringing in somebody like Isaiah Horton, I think, can be helpful and potentially get them from 9-3 up to that 10-11 win and playoff atmosphere.
Yeah, and I think too, one thing on Horton that intrigues me, and gosh, I'm far from a Alabama wide receiver room expert outside of Ryan Williams. Like, to be honest, I don't even really know who all they have running around there anymore. It's hard to keep up. But
that tells you kind of what you need to know, right? Like, yeah. Can you remember somebody from last year other than Ryan Williams? Even if you're not an Alabama fan, if in previous years. Right? How many guys did you know from the Alabama wide receiving corps? Minimum 2, a lot of times 3 or 4, because they just had guys. And last year, while I know they had other receivers outside of Ryan Williams, it seemed like was the only real big time threat. And so he drew a lot of attention. So anyway, continue.
Well, yeah, all I was going to say is just looking at Isaiah Horton's, profile here. And I'm looking now just to confirm, the rest of the Alabama receiver room. Okay, yeah. So as I suspected, so Isaiah Horton is 6'4", 205. The rest of Alabama's receiver room, the tallest guy is like 6'1". So he brings a different element to that team. Mm-hmm. And I'm not making this prediction because I don't know a ton about Isaiah Horton, but last time Kalen DeBoer and Ryan Grubb were together, they had Rome Odunze and Jalen McMillan with Michael Penix, running a very, very, very impressive offense. Well, Rome Odunze is like 6'3", 215, like big body, dude that can go up and get it. Again, I'm not going to sit here and say that Isaiah Horton's Rome Odunze. He certainly has not proven anything close to that, but his body type is very similar. So it's possible he has a similar skill set. At the very least, he seems like a guy that can go up and get it, where Ryan Williams, although he can go up and get it, is much more of a speed threat. He's, I think, 6 foot, 175. You're 6'4", 205. Like, that's a different type of receiver. So it just gives DeBoer and Grubb options in what you mentioned is a very, very, very pressure-filled season ahead. If that's a guy that they can trust, he's going to get a ton of targets simply because, A, Ryan Williams is on the other side taking up a ton of defensive coordinators' brain space, but also because he's 6'4" and he can do things that Ryan Williams can't. Ryan Williams can do things he can't, obviously, too, but just a different skill set. So there's going to be certain situations, play calls, play designs that are going to be specifically tailored to him saying, okay, we got a big body guy. He can go up and get this. Like, let's design a play in this situation to get him the ball, right?
Yeah, without a doubt. So watch out for Isaiah Horton. Could have a really big impact this year for the Tide. And then my final one here on the honorable mention line is Rasul Faison. Another one kind of, getting buried because there's so many transfers, so many potential big impact transfers. But South Carolina losing Rocket Sanders to graduation, who had a great year last year. And then with Lenora Sellers coming into year 2, needing to have a big year, needing to improve in the passing game. I think Rasul Faison, coming from Utah State, has the potential to make a really big impact there because they're going to want to run the ball to take a little bit of pressure off of the passing game for Lenora Sellers. And they're going to want to, utilize him as well as Sellers in the running game to keep the defense on their heels in order to be able to give Sellers better passing lanes, right? Like not tight passing windows, but to give him space when he's throwing to their wide receivers if linebackers and others are cheating up, if their running game is able to be as good as it was this year, if not better. And Faison, he was a 4-star running back out of the portal. He had a pretty solid year last year at Utah State, 198 carries for 1,109 yards, 5.6 average per carry, 8 touchdowns. Also out of the backfield, 22 receptions, close to 100 yards receiving. So he didn't have any touchdowns, but he didn't fumble the ball at all. So he takes care of the ball. And he's 5'11", 200. So not too small, but he's got a decent amount of size to him. So I think that he could really make a big impact in Columbia in a year where Shane Beamer needs to continue the momentum, right? Like keep South Carolina at least where they were this year and hopefully, right, make another big jump because they were right there last year in terms of potentially making that jump. I continue to harp on it. The LSU game was completely stolen from them by the SEC officiating crew. And so they probably should have been in the playoff last year had that loss not happened. And so big year in Columbia for Shane Beamer. I think that Faison can make a big impact because of Rocket Sanders leaving and the need for him in that offense in order to help Lenora Sellers and take a little bit of pressure off of him.
Yeah, I think that's a good call out. I'm glad you brought him up. Our friend Mike Huseman brought him up last week on SEC After Dark because I was curious. Again, I can't keep up with all this stuff, but I was asking him. He's a South Carolina grad, at least for graduate school, but I was asking him, hey, who did they get to replace Rocket Sanders? Because that kind of informs, how I think about their offense or how I think Sellers might do. Because, without a run game or without the threat of the zone read actually even going to a running back, like he could have some trouble because he's certainly not a, Graham Harrell type back there to shout out, 2008 Texas Tech or whatever. But Lenora Sellers' game is not going to be to throw the ball 50 times a game. So they need to have a running game. They need to have a running back. Rocket Sanders this past year was great in the games where he was, healthy towards the back end of the season. So a guy like Faison, who's done it, granted at the, G5 level, but hey, he's older. I think he was in JUCO before he was at Utah State. So he's an older dude. Grown man, ran for 1,000 yards last year. Like, again, with all this stuff in the transfer portal, it seems very hit or miss, but he is certainly a guy that I could see hitting and having, an 800 to 1,000 yard season in Columbia, which is really exactly what they need. Of course, it would be great if, everybody wants a 1,500 yard running back, but that's not reality. And when you have a quarterback like Sellers, who's going to be good throwing the ball and who's going to be good running the ball, like you don't even really need that type of a guy. You just need somebody who can tote the rock 15 plus times a game, and he's going to get you, on average 4 to 5 yards a carry. And Faison seems like a type of guy that can do that. Now we'll see what kind of offensive line South Carolina has. I'm sure Gamecock fans and Beamer alike probably would have loved one of those offensive line transfer portal guys that we flashed up on the screen before or talked about before to be going to Columbia. But they're not, and they'll make do like they have for the last couple of years, really, because their O-line's been pretty bad for a couple of years. But Faison certainly seems like a guy who should get touches and could easily be a very productive player for the Gamecocks.
Yeah, without a doubt. So excited to see him this year, see what he looks like inside that South Carolina offense, and if he's able to take some pressure off of Lenora Sellers. So quickly here, we're coming up on time. We're not going to do a Muschamp Coach of the Week this year, or excuse me, this week. We'll get back to it. I think we'll have a lot of content here from the SEC tournament, and then the start of the NCAA tournament, which I think will come after. So we'll have the NCAA tournament in the next couple of weeks. But at least from the SEC tournament for basketball, we should be able to have a little bit of content for the Muschamp Coach of the Week. And we'll skip the Biscuit of the Week this week as well. But once again, just our sponsor for tonight's show is the Steer Agency. Thank you to those guys for sponsoring us. Football is all about strategy, just like winning in business, whether you're dialing up the perfect play on Saturdays or looking to dominate in public affairs, PR, or digital marketing. You need a team that delivers results, and that's where the Steer Agency comes in. They craft winning strategies that get you seen, heard, and ahead of the competition. Don't just play the game, control it. Visit thesteeragency.com today and take your brand to the next level. So, okay, let's check out just a couple of the other names, and then we can touch on SEC hoops before we get out of here and let everybody head over to ESPN to check out the night game, which I don't even know who's playing right now. We need to check.
So it's SEC Network right now. I think SEC Network, at least all day today, is carrying the games. But unfortunately, we're not really holding anyone up from anything. Mississippi State is beating LSU 44-24 at half. So that's kind of a beatdown. It would appear the LSU Tigers have kind of thrown in the towel on the season, knowing they're not going to the tournament. This is likely it for them. So they seem like they've kind of given up.
They're ready for the pizza party and maybe an ice cream party after a great season, everybody.
Yep. And the fan base will be calling for Will Wade to return, the general. But
yes, that's right. So this is just another kind of look here. This is the top 10 rated transfers who are coming into the SEC. And then this, like we said, we'll talk about defense next week. So Patrick Payton there at number 6 coming into LSU as the edge. We'll talk a little bit about him next week. But a lot of these guys we touched on today. Also, Damon Wilson at edge, headed to Missouri, 5-star coming from Georgia. We'll touch a little bit on him next week. But John Mateer touched on him, Eric Singleton, Nick Anderson, Casey Concepcion, Josh Thompson, Kutas going to Ole Miss. And, a lot of these guys we touched on. So there's a lot of really big-time transfers coming into the SEC this year. So it's going to be fun to watch a lot of those guys. And then here are just a couple other names as well to keep your eye on too. One I wanted to point out, well, there's a couple to point out here for sure. But one is Luke Haas, who at Arkansas had showed real flashes of being a big-time tight end. And in that offense with Ole Miss and them also needing, a solid tight end coming in, they lost Prescorn, headed to the NFL. So he could play a big role in the Ole Miss offense next year. And another one I wanted to point out is J. Michael Sturdivant, 4-star from UCLA, headed to Florida. And, DJ Lagway just needs all the help he can get in terms of weapons. Hey, showed a lot of flashes last year, but still is going to need to continue to improve. And so all the weapons that you can give him on the outside is just going to help him. So I'm interested to see J. Michael Sturdivant in that offense and how much he can help DJ Lagway in Gainesville. Is there any ones that you're looking at on that list, Hammer, that stick out to you?
I'll just touch real quick on two. We didn't touch on them, but Bo Perbula going from Penn State to Mizzou, and then Luke Kromenhoek going from FSU to Mississippi State. I feel very confident Kromenhoek is going to start. I feel fairly confident Perbula is going to start. And both guys, similar kind of situations where, pretty good recruits out of high school. Perbula had been in college longer and just obviously was not starting over Aller at Penn State. Cromanoke, I think, only made it a year at FSU, but got the heck out of Dodge given how big of a dumpster fire that was this year. So, again, both guys similar in the sense of I really have no idea what to expect, although I expect them probably to be playing a lot. So, just guys to keep their eyes on or keep your eye on because they're probably going to have one of the 16 starting jobs in the SEC.
Yeah, without a doubt. Cromanoke was one I was looking at too. It always reminds me of Henry Rowan Gardner. When I look at his name, I can only think of like 10 different ways to say his name the wrong way whenever I see his name.
Yeah. Well, one more note on this list too is Micah Hudson at A&M, the Texas Tech transfer. I don't know if you've heard anything different. As far as I know, he's just not with the program.
I think he's back. I think he's back.
Oh, okay.
There's not a lot coming out about it, but I have seen some video of him running routes and just working out with Marcel Reed in the complexes at A&M. So kind of like, the lull of the offseason, I think you can miss stuff. I saw this on social media 2 or 3 weeks ago, so I don't know if it was recent, but I believe that he is back with the Aggie program after a brief hiatus.
Interesting. Well, that would be big. I guess we'll see because there was really no reason behind his departure either. So obviously he nor the coaching staff has any, obligation to disclose something if they don't want to, but I just bring that up to say it's not like he was kicked off the team, at least as far as I'm aware. So it seems like the door would be open. Would he want to or be able to return? But did just want to touch on that he, we don't know if he's actually going to be on campus in the fall.
Yeah, I'm just kind of trying to look into it a little bit more. It's totally up in the air, unclear whether or not he's going to be back at A&M. The last report that was from an actual reliable resource is from the managing editor and recruiting insider for Horns and Stars Media, which may not even be that reliable, but decently reliable. It seems like Micah Hudson has stepped away for a bit, so I'm not sure. We'll see. That's a good call out. One more that I'm looking at too is Kawan Lacey from Missouri headed to Ole Miss. Ole Miss last year had a little bit of trouble at running back, right? There was a lot of talk about that.
Yeah.
So let's see, 3-star transfer. There was a lot of talk around him about the possibility and the ceiling that he has at running back. And Ole Miss desperately needs a better running game than they had last year. So interested to see what he's able to do there in Oxford.
Yeah, well, I'm actually looking here, just looking up some Micah Hudson stuff. Perhaps some breaking news from @Felipe4Prez in his bio. Says he's a Texas Tech alum. He likes sports, fat women, the desert, and he's also Iowa State men's head basketball coach. But he's reporting that sources close to the A&M football team say that Micah Hudson is returning for the 2025 season. So you heard it from @Felipe4Prez.
Well, to get a competing report, I'm going to have to call on our friend Durag Ag just to see if that report is correct or if he has inside sources at the A&M program who are telling Durag Ag or maybe Durag Mike Elko if Micah Hudson is going to be back next year. So if anybody out there wants to DM either of those two and see if they can get an update on that report, maybe we can flood the zone and get some updates on Micah Hudson's status going into 25. So,
yeah.
All right, let's just touch here briefly before we head out of here. We're already over time. Extra ball here at Biscuits and SEC as always. But no, that's the wrong one. SEC hoops there. There we go. Yeah, so I'm excited for the SEC tournament this week. There's a lot to talk about. Actually, that was the weekend. That was the graphic from last week, but we can touch on it. Looks like we're going to get probably 12, maybe 13 teams in the field. Texas won today, beat Vanderbilt. So that was big. They're still on the bubble. They're still kind of on life support. I think they need to make a little bit more of a run in order to get into the tournament. Arkansas also winning today. They held on. They were about to let South Carolina come back and beat them, but they were able to hang on and keep their bubble status alive. And so they also need to probably keep winning. They still kind of on the fence. They may be in now. However, another win could not hurt, and another win after that if they can get it. So they need to keep winning. But otherwise, really, this is just all about, who wants to win it more, who wants to win the SEC. And there's a lot of teams in this field here, as you can see, who could potentially win it. Alabama's hot right now. Auburn, the number one team in the country, been playing incredible most of the year. Tennessee likely on that 2 line here right now in the tournament, potentially 1 kind of borderline. And then, Florida, Texas A&M, Mizzou, any of these teams can get hot and win this tournament. So going to be a lot of fun. What are you kind of watching for in this tournament?
Yeah, I think the game tonight between Georgia and Oklahoma is big because as of this morning when I sent out the newsletter, according to made-up scientist bracketologist Joe Lenardi, he predicted that Georgia had like above a 90% chance to get in. And then he said Oklahoma was on the bubble, although he was predicting them to get in. But suffice it to say, neither one of these teams feels comfortable. So a win tonight for either one would go a very, very long way into securing them a spot. So I just think it's going to be very competitive. Whereas, some of the earlier matchups today, LSU was not really in it. Vanderbilt seems to be comfortably in. So, they get beat by Texas, who was very, very much desperate. South Carolina put up a valiant effort, but was not going to sniff the tournament. So, you see Arkansas get a much-needed win. You see Texas get a much-needed win. And then there'll be a real fun matchup tonight between the Dogs and Sooners to see who just feels more comfortable. As everybody knows, this time of year, you just don't know what the committee is going to do when there's 68 teams or whatever. Especially because it's kind of unprecedented territory for the SEC to have this many teams in. So everybody, it seems like, is in, consensus that the SEC is not just the best league this year, but really like having a pretty historical season. But at the same time, like, let's not pretend like the SEC gets 10 to 12 teams in every year. We don't. So assuming they, the committee recognizes that, I think we'll get a lot of teams in, but you can't always assume this stuff. Remember, it was not too long ago, 2 or 3 years ago, Buzz Williams and A&M got, left on the doorstep after making a run all the way to the SEC title game. And Buzz was so mad, he, gave that press conference and wrote an open letter to the committee. And, we don't need to rehash that. I'm just saying you don't know until you know. So these teams are all going to want to win and get an auto bid, right? Win the SEC, get an auto bid, because you could get left on the doorstep, no problem.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I will say Joe Lenardi, probably a little bit better source than whatever it was that we just brought up with Durag Ag and whoever your source was for Micah Hudson.
Yeah, some Red Raider for Prez. I don't know his name.
Oh, yes, Red Raider for Prez, yeah. Shout out Red Raider for Prez. Maybe we'll get him a couple more followers after this.
Yeah, well, he's breaking news on the Micah Hudson front. So, if you're invested in whether Micah Hudson will play and where he will play, follow Red Raider, for Prez or whoever.
All right, that I think can be our closing thoughts for the night. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it here at Biscuits SEC. Always a pleasure to be with you guys on Wednesday nights. Please do sign up for the Morning Biscuits newsletter right there, biscuitssec.com/newsletter. I write it on Mondays. Hammer writes it on Fridays during the season. And then in the off season comes to you every Wednesday, all the news and notes around the SEC that you need to know. And then also, as you have seen on the ticker down there, SEC After Dark, as many of you tune into that as well. As we know, that is now on Thursdays. So we will see you guys tomorrow night at 9 o'clock Central, or 9 o'clock Eastern, 8 o'clock Central for SEC After Dark. We're looking forward to that. So you can also follow us on all social media channels at Biscuits and SEC. So please check that out. Biscuits and SEC on YouTube as well. Make sure to subscribe, hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. So enjoy the games tonight, everybody. And we're looking forward to a really fun SEC tournament as well as NCAA tournament. So we'll be back with you guys next week to talk about the top incoming transfers to the SEC on defense. So for Hammer, I am Bossman. Thank you guys again for joining us. We really appreciate it. Biscuits and SEC, we will see you guys next week.
Appreciate y'all. Giggle.